years I have spent trawling attics in southern German homes, or 2 years ago I went to South Africa to look at the private papers of one of the people very close to Hitler that no one had used before. And I was very excited I've been very excited in doing all this, but also in a way it was really a very long way from the place where I grew up to South Africa, both figuratively as well as literally. When I was always interested in history, but I certainly, when I was a little boy growing up in Germany, I was more interested in knights and kings than in Adolf Hitler. But as I was growing up in Germany, of course, inevitably you start to ask questions to yourself about the generation, in my case, of my grandparents, about neighbors who would pass over apples to you and who are very nice, but you may also know, you might not know what these people in particular have been up to, but you know what their generation has been up to. And it is really then when I started to ask questions about that era and also about Hitler, because it is, and I'm saying this here not in order to tell you my autobiography, but in order to tell you why I really want to talk a little bit both about the past as well as the present, because I think in a way talking about Adolf Hitler is about talking about the present in a double way as well. Sometimes it's the saying that we live for 300 years, we live for the 100 years that we are on Earth. We're quite for 100 years on Earth, or most of us at least not. But also what happens in 100 years before us, and as well is shaping us, and we're still shaping the 100 years that come after us. So in that sense, we are all very much products of the world that Adolf Hitler created, whether we want it or not, in clear and not so clear ways. And also, as we see again globalism and globalization being under attack, we see again a rise in collectivism, authoritarian collectivism of both the left and the right. And it is because of those kinds of dynamics that I've really become really interested in working on Adolf Hitler in recent years, and in trying to kind of both unearth about how maybe we are a result of that society, of Adolf Hitler more than we may think. Certainly neither victims nor perpetrators normally find it easy to talk about this, everyone knows how there's silences in the families of perpetrators, but the same is true in the families of victims. For instance, my wife didn't know until I told her a few years ago that the grandfather of her grandfather was killed in the Holocaust. It is also something that, even though it has consequences, it's consequences that are not necessarily openly spoken about. So I'm trying to want to tease that out a little bit, but also I want to really make the point that when we look for the warning signs of new Hitlers, we often look for the wrong signs, and I think we're looking for the wrong signs because we are looking for, because we have the wrong understanding of how Hitler first became Hitler, because ultimately we still believe far too much the story that Adolf Hitler told us himself. And that's also in a way how I first came to Hitler. I mean, again, even though I told you how I came to have a genuine interest in the topic as I was growing up, I still didn't think that I would work on Hitler specifically, because outwardly I still thought, well, there's just so many books on Hitler. But if we could maybe just see the next picture from the PowerPoint, I increasingly realized that we were, when we were really talking about how Hitler became Hitler, we were really talking about a man without a face. Here we see Adolf Hitler during the First World War, and it's of course a blurry photograph, but I think it also quite neatly encapsulates the idea of what we really know about Hitler is if we take away the story that Hitler himself is telling, we are left with a man without a face. And it's incredibly difficult to try to give a face back to this man because the traces were just destroyed so thoroughly during the Third Reich. And this is how I first came to Hitler. This is when maybe as a kind of background for those of you who are not that familiar with the scholarship on Hitler, until about the 1990s, people had believed Albert Hitler's story that he had already been radicalized while growing up in Austria, while being a young man in Vienna, and then came this book in the 1990s that really showed that it doesn't quite add up, that during his Vienna years, Hitler wasn't really particularly radicalized, that he also still had close interactions with Jews and so on. So people then said, well, if it wasn't that time, then it must have been the First World War that really made Hitler, and that also in a way connected with the story that the Nazis were trying to tell themselves about the First World War being the moment of birth of National Socialism. The story here was Hitler was a typical product of the First World War, of the German experience of the First World War. He was the personification of the unknown German soldier. He entered the war just as a normal German, and like all Germans, he was turned into a National Socialist through the experiences of the First World War, and he was a typical product of his regiment. He became an anti-Semite, and at the end of the war, he was ready to enter politics. And that story just, for me, didn't add up. And I spent several years trying through looking at the group biography of the man of his regiment, I really tried to show that story didn't add up. And that in fact, even Hitler returned from the war with still fluctuating political ideas. That in fact, far from being the personification of the unknown soldier or being a typical product of his regiment, the men of his regiment were cold shouldering him for, because, maybe not because of his political ideas, but because he was serving as a dispatch runner, as a messenger for regimental headquarters, so they thought he had an easy life. Maybe that was unfair, but the point is not whether it is subjectively fair. The point is that was the perception. And as a result of that, they didn't want to have anything to do with him. And that was, of course, not a very good story for Hitler when he wanted to enter politics and tell the story of his political life as a kind of quasi-autobiography. For that, he had to ruthlessly invent a past that was politically useful. So what I really was trying to show is that not as people had previously believed, that the story that Hitler himself was telling in Mein Kampf and elsewhere was not just an embellishment of a true story, but I really tried to show that the very core of that story was rotten, that it really did not add up at all. And what I produced, therefore, was a book that was making these points. And I thought, after that, I felt pretty Hitlered out. I felt tired of having to deal with Hitler, and I thought I would move on. But here I am talking about another book on Hitler. And the reason why I did this, why I decided that I really felt an urge to figure out what was coming next, was because I felt that people, after reading my first book on Hitler, said, well, sure, that seems plausible, but how do you explain them that within a year's time, Hitler is very much radicalized? He is a radical anti-Semite. He's a leading National Socialist. How is that possible? And at that point, I realized that through my previous book, I had really just changed the parameters in a way I had by solving one riddle. I had created a new riddle, and it was at that point that I really wanted to solve that riddle myself, and that is what I have what I did in the Adolf Hitler. So Hitler returns from the war with still fluctuating political ideas. Anti-Semitism is still not important enough. for him to openly voice it, if it existed at all. And then he lived through short-lived Munich, through the revolutionary period, as well as the short-lived Munich Soviet Republic. And it is that story that I want to share with you. I want to take the story forward up to the mid-1920s, because in a way, it's, even though I think that Hitler was politicized and radicalized in the period immediately after the First World War, I also think that that Hitler was still surprisingly flexible in his views, and reconfigured his racism, for instance, in a radical fashion until the mid-1920s. So if we could see the next photograph, please. So Hitler returns after the war to Munich. The reason why he returns to Munich is because he has to demobilize there. Later he would tell the story that this was really the milieu out of which he had grown. Munich would, of course, be presented as a city of the movement, of the National Socialist movement, during the Third Reich. That's, of course, not entirely wrong, but it's also it is certainly true that the National Socialist Party had been founded in Munich. It is also true that during the First World War, Hitler had not particularly liked Munich and Bavaria on the few visits that he came back home, because he felt that people were insufficiently supportive of the German war effort. He felt that people were blaming more the British and the French. Sorry, they were blaming the Prussians more for the war than the British and the French. And so so at the end of the war, he really just wanted to visit places like Berlin for that reason. And also for quite some time, even as the party grows in Munich and Hitler is radicalized, it is really less with the political establishment of Bavaria that he connects than with other radical nationalists who, for one reason or another, had made Munich their home. Many of whom, like him, were ethnic Germans who had been born outside the borders of Bavaria. So in that sense, I also want to make the story here is that it's not useful, as we're so often told in Hitler biographies, that Hitler is just this kind of typical product of the political milieu of Munich and Bavaria after the First World War. And this is not a political argument at all, because inside of Germany these arguments then very quickly become meshed up with questions of identity and so on. I personally couldn't care less as to whether the Bavarians are presented here in a positive or negative way, in a way that, even though earlier I spoke about the connection to the present, once we talk about questions like that, I think we really have got to take the position, look at the recent past as if it happened a million years ago, and not get quite involved in those kinds of questions. But that's the distraction. So let's get to the next image. But let's talk about Hitler during the revolutionary period. So after the First World War, the monarchies of Germany fell. Revolution happened. Germany was turned into a republic. And the revolution was in Bavaria more radical than in the rest of Germany. And it was also crucially led by a revolutionary leader called Eisner, who was Jewish. And as Hitler now returns from the war, he is not, as would have been normal for a soldier from his kind of unit, he's not demobilized, but he deliberately tries to stay in the army. And that is, in a way, quite an uphill struggle, because of the armistice conditions in the war. He has no choice. Germany has no choice but then to reduce the number of soldiers, and therefore everyone is kind of is encouraged to be demobilized. But Hitler really wants to stay on. This might have to do with opportunistic personal reasons, that Hitler really had no home to return to, that in a way
the army had become his home, or regimental headquarters of his unit had become his home. So he desperately wants to try to hold on to that. But it also signifies a willingness on Hitler's part to serve the revolution. Because what he has got to do now, for instance, when in the winter of 1918-1919, he is serving in a former POW, a camp for POWs outside of Munich, he has got to serve the revolution, and he has got to defend the revolutionary regime against attacks, including against anti-Semitic attacks. If we could have the next image, please. And Hitler also continued to stand by the revolution as it became more and more radical, as it devoured its own children. It started out already being more radical than in Berlin, but it became successively more radical, particularly after the assassination in February of that Jewish leader of the revolution. Here we see a photograph from the funeral march of for Kurt Eisner, where we may or may not see Hitler in this photograph, but there, for various reasons, there are good reasons to believe that Hitler did indeed attend the funeral march, and even if he didn't, the fact remains that he continued to serve in the army. He continued to serve this revolutionary leader as well as the more radical leaders that followed, and he didn't just keep his head down. He even stood for the first time for any kind of position of influence as the representative of the man of his unit during the revolution, and later he would try to sell this as an idea that he was a secret spokesperson of everyone spoke against the revolution, but that just doesn't add up, because we have the election results from the Bavarian election from January from the units in which Hitler served, because there were special polling stations. And from that we know that the overwhelming majority, I think between 80-90%, voted for either moderate or radical left-wing parties. So it's inconceivable to believe that if they had seen in Hitler a radical right-wing figure, that they would have voted for him at that point. And even during the short-lived Munich Soviet Republic in April of 1919, when so many others did leave the army, including Hitler's closest peer from that period, Hitler stayed on. He did not join a right-wing militia that would fight against that unit, against that Soviet Republic, but he would stay on. Of course, the question is now, what do we make of this? What does this signify in terms of Hitler's political radicalization? I think at the very least it shows that at that point Hitler has no problem serving left-wing revolutionary regimes. It is still someone, like so many other Germans after the war, who is still trying to find a new political home, who's returned from the war. He's returned from the war and sees the old world shattered and is trying to find a new space in it. So it's quite common that people were moving from the left to the right, but we should also see here that maybe the move between certain support of certain kind of left-wing movements and Alpine National Socialism is maybe less weird than it might appear when we take into account that there are or if we don't look at politics as a continuum on just one line from radical left to radical right, but if we look, for instance, as if we understand politics as a kind of triangular between liberalism, left-wing collectivism, and right-wing collectivism, where there are similarities in terms of approaches to collectivism and even to the nation between left-wing and right-wing collectivist movements. And my point here would be to say that for Hitler, as long as these left-wing collectivist movements did not reject the nation as such, he would be willing to support them. But again, we also have here then the competition with this kind of personal opportunism of needing a home. But then, of course, he has got a big problem. You could see the next picture. we have a big problem right after with the defeat of the Munich Soviet Republic in early May, because whatever his real beliefs were, at the very least, he had to face the problem that he was that he could be easily perceived as a member of the Red Army. And so, which was particularly precarious at the moment in which summary executions of members of the Red Army took place in Munich. And at that point, Hitler became a turncoat and offered his services for a investigation unit that looked into the involvement of the men of Hitler's unit in the revolutions, in the Munich Soviet Republic, and that might have also politically worked for Hitler quite well, because I think it's fair to say that even though I think Hitler had missed the opportunity to jump ship and had continued to serve the Munich Soviet Republic, I think it's also quite clear that ultimately the internationalist socialism of the Munich Soviet Republic would have been out of sync with Hitler's ideas. So I think in that sense, to inform on the most radical and internationalist socialist in his unit did not cause a major problem for Hitler. By turning into a turncoat, Hitler has also got another lease of life in the army. Again, he has not to be demobilized at a moment at which otherwise units that had served in Munich during the Soviet Republic were to be disbanded because they were seen as politically unreliable. And what happens then is that Hitler soon would become a so Hitler continues to now serve the counter-revolutionary restoration in Munich, which was headed by the Army Group Commando 4 in Munich, and it is through them that he soon would be trained politically as a political agitator. But what would happen in the meantime is Hitler's politicization and radicalization. Is kind of his political epiphany, his road to Damascus experience. And I quite deliberately used religious language here, because that is also later how Hitler, the Nazis, sold these ideas themselves in order to present Hitler as a kind of new messiah. But I think Hitler really had quite a genuine political epiphany with the signing and ratification of the Versailles Treaty. And my point here is not to somehow say whether or not the Versailles Treaty was too harsh. You may be familiar with these kind of narratives that because the Versailles Treaty was so harsh, there was a direct way to the Second World War and the Holocaust. That's an entirely different story, and I also think I personally think that story is not even true. It doesn't add up. The Versailles Treaty matters because it signifies for Hitler, for so many other Germans, the delayed realization of defeat. Before that, a lot of Germans had thought that the First World War had maybe not ended particularly well for the Germans, but they still thought it was a draw. And they thought that even though it wasn't maybe a particularly even draw, that the Americans would make sure that there would be a just peace. So it was a total shock that the Versailles Treaty would happen, and that it was signed and ratified by the German government and parliament, because there it became clear to Germans they really and truly had lost the war. And this is the moment of, I argue, of Hitler's politicization and radicalization, because what he's now doing is he's asking himself two questions. One, how could we have lost the war? And maybe more importantly, because he doesn't just want to refight the last war, how would Germany have to be recast in order to be safe for all times in a rapidly changing world? For there was a belief, not just for Hitler, that the world was really, the international system was undergoing a transformation towards today we would say, world of super empires or superpowers. And Hitler really wanted to understand what are the reasons or the primary reasons for Germany's domestic weakness and Germany's external weakness, in order to be able to find an answer of how Germany would have to be recast in order to be safe for all times. And in that sense, I also present Hitler as a kind of serious man of ideas. He's often presented as a kind of a nihilist who was just full of hatred and who was just driven purely by revenge. And in fact, that is, at least in Hitler's self-perception, which obviously he was full of hatred and all that, but in his self-perception, that was not how he saw things. In fact, in his first anti-Semitic letter that he would write in September, he would make the point that an anti-Semitism of emotion, of pogroms, of violence, is not the answer. I'm paraphrasing here, but he's saying, well, you might feel good about that, you might feel good about yourself, but it's not solving a single thing. You have got to really solve problems once and for all. Hitler, unlike so many other Germans, are also not talking about, you may be familiar with the stab in the back theory, how supposedly victorious Germany had been stabbed in the back and now had to take revenge. That's not really Hitler's language. Hitler really wants to understand the nature of things in order to make Germany safe for all times. And of course, the first principles of his worldview are crazy. They are irrational. But once you accept those first principles, there is a kind of inner coherence in the way he put things together. And my argument would be that he is quite seriously engaging with ideas. And the answers he comes up with is that the primary reason for Germany's domestic weakness is the result of the supposedly pernicious and negative influence of Jews. But he is at that point focusing maybe less on Jewish bodies, and he's also not, as most people in Munich do after the revolution, he's not focusing on the fact that supposedly the revolution had been run by the Jews, because his anti-Semitism here is really driven first and foremost by anti-capitalism. It is about supposedly Jewish ideas of finance, capitalism, and he says that is making, those kind of ideas is making Germany domestically weak because it is creating social inequality and so on. And therefore he advocates that those kinds of ideas, those kinds of, you may say, globalist ideas, have got to be purged from Germany for Germany to be strong enough to be able to succeed in this international competition of states. And the other point is that Germany has, or the primary source for Germany's external weakness is supposedly insufficient territory, manpower, and resources. Therefore, in order for Germany to become one of those superpowers, Germany needs far more territory and manpower. Although he is still for quite some time surprisingly flexible in the answers he finds. He is, in terms of the fundamental questions he has been asking ever since his politicization, radicalization, he is inflexible. They're the guiding questions until the day he dies in the ruins of the Reichschancellor in Berlin in 1945. In terms of the general answer for what is the primary weakness, external and internal weakness of Germany, he's also very consistent. But beyond that, he's really still continuing to search for ideas, and he is, in anything that is not relating to the Jews, but more about that in a few minutes, he is still quite flexible. So it is those questions and the answers to them that drives him until the day he dies, and it is also the kind of searching for answers on a kind of tactical and operational level to how the broader realizations of what needs to be done can be translated into politics that is Hitler, keeps Hitler going. If you could have the next picture. So I'm presenting here as Hitler as someone who's maybe far more searching himself, and is an active person who is someone who is thinking and also who quickly becomes a political operator, rather than the kind of man who we're normally presented with in recent years, where we have the picture that supposedly of a Hitler being radicalized in post-revolutionary Munich as he's taking this propaganda course in the summer of 1919, as he becomes a propagandist of the guy on the right-hand side, Karl Mayr, who is kind of the guy who let the genie out of the bottle, and where the idea is that Hitler is just the kind of guy who soaks up ideas like a sponge. And he's a typical product of the right-wing milieu in the German army and also of the Bavarian establishment. And that Hitler's main talent is more in terms of speaking. And the idea there is then also often that until the mid-1920s, Hitler doesn't really know himself, even what he wants, what role he himself has. And I don't think that that is a story that quite adds up. And it's even in the summer of 1919 when can we have the next picture, please? He has actually not found a new home yet. For instance, this Irish volunteer in the German armed forces has got to save Hitler from being beaten up by soldiers to whom he was speaking as a propagandist. And could we have the next picture? Let's actually jump over it because the time is. Let's have the next one. So Hitler really hasn't found a new home yet. He only finds that home in September of 1919. But there he immediately connects with them. He just jumps up in order to disagree with someone who's making a case for Bavarian separatism. And through that, the leader of the Nazis there think, wow, this guy is amazing, and he asks him to come back. And that is can we have the next picture, his journey into the Nazi party. And what happens then, to just really fast forward so we have enough time for discussion, is that over the next couple of years, Hitler first becomes the star speaker of the Nazi party, and then eventually becomes the leader of the Nazi party by 1921. It is very much down to Hitler's talents as a speaker that this small group, this splinter group, turns from or profits from the consolidation of all these right-wing groups in Munich, that the Nazi party comes out on top. By 1921, Hitler becomes the leader of the Nazi party. And by 1923, he thinks he's strong enough to start a putsch. But again, as I indicated earlier, at that point, the traditional Bavarian elite is not really quite standing behind him. I mean, they see him in 1923 when the putsch stand. They think that they can use him as a tool, as a useful idiot, as someone who ultimately has different end goals from the Bavarian establishment, who want to return more sovereignty to Bavaria. So exact opposite from what Hitler wants, but they think that's still useful. And Hitler is really socializing with, for instance, the German girl from New York, so with other ethnic Germans who are living in Munich. Go to the next picture. But by 1923, by the summer of 1923, Hitler realizes that his quest to become a leading figure of the German national right has really not been fast enough, because even though people already start speaking about him in terms of the German Mussolini or the Bavarian Mussolini, by that time, Hitler had taken a strategy or a tactic that he would, for instance, not allow himself to be photographed, and that he hadn't really spoken yet about his own life. And a German satirical magazine did this spread in 1923 about what Hitler could look like. So to make fun of the fact that people were talking about Hitler, but no one knew what Hitler would look like. Hitler could still walk the streets of Munich at that time without being recognized. And in that context, Hitler radically changes his tactics, because Hitler really feels, as so many other people do, that there is a revolution is in the air, both on the left and the right, there is that perception. In fact, in October of 1923, the German Communist Party has already instructed all its branches that revolution would start the following morning, and it was only called out at 11 p.m. at night. Likewise, there was a feeling on the radical right that the revolution was around the corner. And it's in that context that Hitler decided that if he wanted to become Germany's Mussolini, people would have got to know what he looks like, and he would also know what more about his life. Can we have the next picture? So he has got these propaganda photographs being taken, and then could also the next picture again. He, in the summer of 1923, and this brings me to Johannesburg or South Africa, he decides that he would, both through interviews he gave, newspaper interviews he gave, but also this book behind which he was the driving force, he would start to tell his political life through his biography. He would invent a politically useful past where he would present himself as a new kind of political leader who comes out of nowhere, because there was this urge in Germany across political party lines that new kinds of leaders who were not established elites should become leaders. And that was an opening for Hitler, so he presented himself as this kind of new German messiah, but because it doesn't look very good to say, but I'm the messiah, he has this book written and was actually centrally involved in it, and then it's been published, even though he's a driving force, amongst by someone else's name. Of course, if you could have the next picture. Things don't go so well for Hitler. The putsch fails. And the putsch maybe also comes too fast. The book had not really hadn't had really its impact yet. Put up the next picture. And Hitler is suicidal, but then during the trial following Hitler's putsch, he really seizes an opportunity in there. In a way, here we saw a classic Hitler who has not foreseen crises, but who has a talent to respond to crises and turn defeats into victories in moving flexibly, using things flexibly in order to get closer to his political goals. The trial starts as a Ludendorff trial of the other guy in the trial, and it ends as a Hitler trial. I should have said earlier is that Hitler was paying the lip service, that he was just being the drummer for someone else. This is also why he couldn't write the book himself, while in reality making a space for himself. Could we have the next picture? And of course, through the trial, he becomes a national figure. Also then through the writing of Mein Kampf. We could have the next image. Let's ignore this image for a moment. I want to just say 2 or 3 more things. One of the things is about Hitler's secret Russian collusion, which is interesting also insofar to actually show how Hitler's answers to these broader questions still changes. Because you know how I talked about that Hitler really thought that Germany had insufficient territory and resources, but he didn't think Germany on its own could do it. Therefore, he's advocating a permanent alliance with a restored Tsarist Russia. He intermingles, for instance, here we see the wife of one of the pretenders to the Russian throne in Bavaria with these Russian exiles, in the hope that a nationalist and anti-Semitic regimes could be reestablished in both states, and the idea that a permanent alliance between those 2 countries, and an all-encompassing alliance, would make Germany safe for all times. So at that point, he still treats Russians as his best buddies. And then, during the writing of Mein Kampf, and with the realization that after Lenin's death, that the Soviet Union is there to stay, he suddenly turns Russians into subhumans. He radically changes his racism. It is also my argument why his racism is fundamentally, his other racisms are fundamentally different from Hitler's anti-Semitic racism, because in his anti-Semitic racism, he's surprisingly consistent and radical, but in his other racisms, he is flexible, and his racism is in a way a result of his geopolitical considerations rather than the other way around as we normally think. Could I have the next picture? And I'm also arguing that the road to Auschwitz might have been from Munich, might have been long, but less twisted than is usually believed. Because what I'm trying to show here is that the anti-Semitism was surprisingly radical, it was surprisingly literal, and it also and it was in private more radical than in public, which is also unusual for his other compared to his other ideas. And in private, he already lays out that the best idea would be to kill them all. He just, at that point, decides that it's just not practical. Therefore, he considers the possibilities of it, or he's considering second or third best final solutions. But I think we need to take rather more seriously that he all along had a preferred final solution that he just thought at that point was not possible to implement. If we could have the final image, and just a very, sorry, I've talked about all this slightly too long, so I really wanted to talk quite a bit more about the world today. But the thing when it comes to talking about what we can actually, isn't there one more image? Yeah. What we can learn about this for today, it's less in the terms of these kind of direct Hitler, Trump, or Hitler, whoever comparisons as we so often do, but more in trying to see what the conditions are in which demagoguery becomes possible, in which the nature of politics changes radically, where the fabric of liberal democracy is undermined, where a politics of adversaries is turned into a politics of enemies. And in that sense, we're also much closer to the populism of the late 19th century in the wake of the financial crash of 1873. So the crash of globalism of the late 19th century is I think far more similar to what we're experiencing now than the 1920s. But then again, we of course also know that the 1920s followed the 1890s or 1880s. So in that sense, we shouldn't just say we shouldn't be too relaxed. And the problem also is with demagoguery or with populism is that the language people use is almost always the same, but what's behind it is very different. You have ranging from harmless populists to the kind of Hitlers, but you normally only know in hindsight what kind of demagogue you've ended up with. And that's why I think the main lessons really should be is how we can protect the fabric of liberal democracy in order to avoid that political opponents are being turned into political enemies. Thank you.